Manage mentoring for getting started in beekeeping. This is Introduction to Splits. I am Kevin England. There are many compelling reasons to split honeybee colonies, and in this lesson we'll explore how to use splits and some management practices. We'll talk about the background considerations that you need to know and some of the foundational instructions for successfully splitting a colony. Splitting a colony is one of the core management practices of beekeeping. As demonstrated by the slide, there are a wide number of reasons why one would split a honeybee colony. Two of the more prevalent practices are splitting for growing your operation and splitting for swarm management. It could be noted that beekeepers use the word divide or making a divide as an alternative term to using the word split, and they're pretty much interchangeable. Like other management practices, understanding the prerequisites are part of splitting colonies. One of the key considerations for making splits is to examine the base colony and ensure that it is fit for purpose when it comes to splitting it. Another aspect of this is to ensure that we do no harm. In making the split, we want to be sure that both of the colonies that result are viable when they are at their end state of going on their own. To perform a split logically requires additional equipment to put the new colony in. The equipment required depends upon the plan you're going to implement. In a broad sense, it mostly translates to a full stack hive setup: roof, inner cover, boxes, frames, foundation, and bottom board, as well as a place to house the hive, meaning a location to put it. We always say, plan the work and then work the plan. Walk the path of your split and make sure that everything is in place. And be sure to mind the details. For example, beyond the base equipment, make sure that you have an entrance reducer. That's another required piece of equipment. Another logical consideration is centered on the timing of the split. You need to evaluate the state of the original colony at the time the split is made and assess how they're going to fare in the period required for them to stabilize. Be sure that the window of operation is viable as you make your plans. This typically is predicated on your ability to feed the new colony and the availability of forage for the bees to use during stabilization, as well as operable temperature ranges. In the types of splits slide, there was an outlier. Not technically a split, but in practice the activity is so close a parallel, and I'm talking about equalizing hives. Equalizing hives is a practice which you extract resources out of one hive and move them to another. Usually the purpose is to take some of the vigor out of one hive while propping up another. Again, by definition, this is technically not a split, but you can use your split know-how to perform this operation, so we've included it in this lesson for consideration. When performing a traditional split, you find the queen and move her to the new colony. This is a conditional situation, and we'll cover some of the other conditions in the next few slides. But as to the traditional split, you move the queen and support that with a complement of frames that have the resources needed to get the new colony off to a good start. In short, as the slide indicates, you support the move with the resources as outlined. The base practice is to create a hive in miniature. A simple hive has a queen, a brood area, pollen, nectar, and honey. You would move the resources into the new hive in a manner that emulates the typical nest structure as outlined on the slide, with the brood in the middle, surrounded by pollen, and any nectar and honey to the outside. One item you need to plan for in your execution relates to your ability to move the queen. Sometimes hives in spring are booming, and the task of locating the queen provides challenging. Give time for the inspection, and if you know going in that it might be difficult to locate the queen, consider using a queen excluder in advance to isolate her and make her easier to find. Add the queen excluder in the week prior, and you should divide the frames you need to inspect for the queen in half. The box that has young brood in progress is the one that's housing the queen. Once you find the queen, you have a choice to make. Ideally, you would be able to take the frame, queen and all, to the new hive. Sometimes, however, the queen is not found on a frame that you want to move. This situation requires you to move the queen to the new colony directly, usually done by an adept beekeeper by picking the queen up and moving her. For a new beekeeper, this might be a daunting proposition. Having the ability to pick up a queen from a frame is likely considered an intermediate skill, and we don't cover it here. Note that you might consider using a market-provided queen marking device that lets you place it over top of the queen, sequester her in the device, close it, and then you could pick it up and transfer her that way. Again, a topic for a different dedicated lesson. One tip though, if you want to learn how to pick up a queen, reach down and pick up drones by their wings. They're not going to sting you, and you can get a lot of practice that way, and then eventually you can take that leap to reach down, pick up a queen by her wings without doing any harm, and moving her over to the new frame. Now we're coming back to the conditional item that we spoke about a few slides ago. The diversity of techniques for splitting a hive is quite wide. For example, if you're performing the operation called an artificial split, then you will move the standing queen to the new hive equipment. Conventionally, as we've been saying, that's the norm, but factually, you could perform different procedures. Perhaps your desire is to keep the existing queen in the hive. You could perform alternative techniques to move resources out of the origin hive and leave the resident queen in place. This comes into play if you want to take a contingent of swarm cells and start a new hive with them, while leaving the queen in place as outlined on the slide. Perhaps you'll perform a split with no queen and no queen cells. This is another option for making a split. It presumes, of course, that you're going to source a queen from another place or let the colony rear their own. To rear their own, the new colony will need a frame that has larvae of the right age. Larva that's just transformed from egg to larva is the right age for workers to make a queen. And you could, of course, purchase a queen for your split and install her through the common methods, much the same way that a queen is provided for a package. Switching to another instruction, one consideration you have to evaluate is whether you're going to relocate your split. The premise behind this tactic is that the origin bees are going to fly back to the origin hive if they're within proximity. The recommended management practice is take the split that you make to a location that's at least 3 miles away from the original apiary. One suggestion we have in the program is to find other friends in beekeeping, and if you did that, perhaps you can relocate your split in the other person's apiary for a period of time, and reciprocate with them when they have the need. The premise here is keep all the bees in the split by moving it away. There's another play to consider. The option is move the original colony from its location and place your split on that hive stand. In this manner, the original bees would likely come back to the split and add to its population. Since the split was taken from the origin hive, it's going to have the queen that they were used to and emanate the colony scent. Now this requires a little work on your part, but it's no less than going the other path, which was to relocate the split. The truth is some beekeepers just make a split and set it over in the side yard and ignore the guidance to move it 3 miles away. Whatever happens with the bees as they move around is what happens. At least there'll be a core nucleus to get going, maybe not as strong, but that's the way you do it without having to fuss over moving a hive 3 miles away. In performing this approach, as long as there's a reasonable amount of brood and the queen is resident in the split, the bulk of the bees that moved into the split will stay put, and some of the foragers will go back to the original hive. The colony in the split carries on with the bees to stay resident, and it may set them back a touch, but it's far less work for you, the beekeeper. So how you handle this is personal preference, but the recommended quote unquote proper way is move the split out of the apiary for a period of time. In a week's time or so, you would retrieve the split and bring it back to your yard. When do you know that time is right? When you see the bees have oriented and begun operation in the former place, then you could pick them up and bring them back to your yard, and they will reorient when you place them back in your apiary. In the next lesson, we will provide a step-by-step instruction of the physical process of how to perform a traditional split. Now, it stands to reason that as you take resources out of the origin colony, you're going to have to consider what to put back to put that colony back in service. Here you have options, with the most likely approach to replace the frames with either foundation or drawn comb. You could theoretically also compact the original colony into a smaller footprint, but this is not really that typical. After you make your split, you'll want to consider their needs for both protection and growth. If you split them into a nuke box and they're sitting amongst full-size hives, they stand some risk of being robbed, and the smaller workforce would be at a disadvantage when trying to defend against bigger hives nearby. One reason to make splits during the main forage season is that big colonies would be preoccupied with forage and not really concerned with opportunistic robbing. Now, the opposite would be true if you were doing that during the summer season, trying to make splits for next year. So consider the time of year that you're performing the operation and make sure that this split, if at risk, you close down the entrances and maybe even move them away from the main apiary until they grow to full size. It gives them a better chance to deal with any risks that they might have. If you're not in the height of forage season, you're going to want to supply them with 1-to-1 sugar water solution to stimulate their growth. That's 1 part sugar to 1 part water. By weight or volume, it doesn't matter. Make sure you feed them all the way through until you get them to full size. As you conduct your split activities, make sure you maintain a proper schedule to stay on top of the maintenance. Plan when to move the split back into the apiary, plan how much you're going to feed, and plan a path for adding equipment to keep up with their expansion. You should know that a split during the height of forage season will grow rapidly, and make sure that you have everything ready in advance and are proactive about keeping ahead of the growth of the colony. As noted earlier, not every split starts with moving the queen over. If you're performing a split where the operation requires the queen to emerge and go out and get mated, it's only logical to make sure that when you're performing this operation, you account for drones being present in order to mate with your queen. One last bit of commentary to share in this lesson about a specific type of split which is centered on Varroa mite management. To be honest, this is a little bit of an unusual reason to make splits, but some beekeepers practice making splits in order to address the dynamics of mite population within the colony. It distributes the mite population, it creates a brood break, and it performs other dynamics that are advantageous as part of a mite management program. The principle here is that if you split the origin colony, you're disrupting the development cycle of the Varroa mites. The concept's known as a brood break, and since the origin colony gets a break from brood production due to not having a queen. One thing to suggest is measuring the mite loads in the colonies, and if they're high, consider a possible mite treatment, which is part of the strategy of dividing the mites and treating while you have a period where they're not under the cappings because there's no queen in operation, and eventually any of the brood that's present will hatch out, emerge, and as the mites are all exposed to treatments, when you're in a brood break, you perform a treatment and you take the mites down by knocking out the population. This closes out the lesson for Introduction to Splits. The following lesson focuses more on specific instructions for conducting different variations of splits. After the split lessons, we're going to cover a hive swarms and swarm trap lesson. If you have any questions about this lesson or any of the lessons, you can ask at our next online session. You can also send an email to the address on the slide. If you're watching from YouTube, you can leave a comment below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you at the next lesson.